So this story's it's hard to tell, and it actually gave me nightmares for about 6 months after this event, because until that night in 2013 in South Africa, I'd only really witnessed a murder scene on TV or at the movies, and I'd never seen that much blood in real life, on the walls, soaked into the carpet and couch, and later what I realised was called spatter everywhere. This was Alan's house, an African brother who joined the church I'd started 3 years earlier with his wife and 4 beautiful kids. They were awesome. The kids, Nathan was the eldest. He was the drummer in the church band, and all of them were in the youth group that my girls, Corrie and Abby, were leading. But Alan always struggled. I knew from day one that there was something off. He was covered in gold medallions and necklaces, always had a lot of money, and always carried a few mobile phones around. In fact, he would come to dinner, but always be answering different phones. And I quickly discovered that he was the main importer of cannabis from Joburg into the town, and that just basically meant that wherever he went, there was trouble that followed him. On that night, I got a call from Nath, and he was crying and just pleading for me to come over to the house. When I arrived, it was just a haze of police lights and crime scene tape everywhere and total, utter despair. I entered the small house, and the whole family were huddled in the living room, because only an hour before there'd been a fight over drugs, and a dealer had come in with a gun and shot 2 guys. One bled out on the bed and died on the kid's bed, and the other was lucky, but the bullet went through his face and his cheek, and that was basically responsible for the fact that there was blood everywhere. Now, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say I walked into the middle of a crisis. For the injured, for the family, especially for the 4 kids who saw it all. And I think for me who stood there asking this question, God, what on earth do I do here? Specifically, how do I show love in this situation? How do I personify love in the middle of such a crisis when all hell was breaking loose, and when the need seemed much more than my ability to help, my capacity to love? Well, I'll come back to that story in a minute, and I'll tell you what I did and what happened. Because this weekend, as we know, the whole world will be saturated with this word love. It's Valentine's Day, and if we ever needed to really love, I believe it's now. If we ever really needed to understand that word, it's now, because our world seems to be in continual crisis today. If it's not a pandemic, it's terrorism, or if it's not terrorism, it's global warming or whatever. But even closer to home, I just believe there's people watching right now in a real crisis. It might be broken relationships, facing possible unemployment, mental illness, depression, hurt, or pain. The list goes on. But here's my question. How do you bring love into all of this? How do we love? Who do we love? Well, I stood there on that night asking those questions. I found the answer. I found the answer in the Bible in a love letter written by the beloved disciple. That's what he's called. His name's John. And he wrote this letter to first century believers who were in a terrible crisis. They were facing awful persecution because of their faith. They were facing death or torture, and probably asking the same questions we are asking in these days of COVID and in the lockdown. So I just want to read you from 1 John chapter 4, verse 7. You maybe track with me if you've got a Bible there. 1 John 4, starting at verse 7. John says this: "Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God." I love those few words, for love comes from God. Love comes from God. You might get love from somewhere else today, and that's great. From a special relationship, from a boyfriend, girlfriend, a spouse, a family member, or even your church. In fact, I hope you feel love today watching this from at least one of those sources. But remember, John says here, love comes from God. God is and must remain the source of your love, because every other source at some point in your life will fail you, friend. As a church, we're committed to loving each other. I'm committed as the leader of this church to loving you. But you must understand there will be times without people to give you love. Yet there will be times of loneliness, of singleness, of emptiness that may last a moment or may last for months. The Apostle John spent his last years banished to an island of Patmos. He died alone, as did the Apostle Paul and many other great men and women that we find in the Bible and throughout history. But they knew this secret. They knew the secret that John knew, that love comes from God. They knew how to fill up on God's love and how to receive from the real, pure source of love. If you're blessed today with family, friends, relationships, and I hope you are, please remember, don't latch on to that for your love. Don't become dependent on that, because the Bible teaches us, John's telling us through history right now, love comes from God. Always remain dependent on God. And then the next verse, verse 8. The next verse says this, whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. God is love. God doesn't just love, his defining character is love. It doesn't say God is faith, God is power, God is great, God is holy. He's all of those things. Muslims declare Allah is great. Their God is great, but we declare God, our God is love. And John, like he wants to get this across to us, he repeats it in verse 16. Track with me, verse 16, 1 John 4. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God, and God in him. In this way, love is made complete among us, so that we will have confidence on the day of judgment, because in this world we are like him. If you've got a pen and you're reading a paper Bible today, that's worth underlining. In this world, we are like him. How are we like him? How are we like him? We're like him because we can be the channels for his love. We can be his hands of love, his voice of love, his feet of love in any crisis that we face or go through. In any pressure situation, can I ask you today, put you on the spot, are you prepared for that today, to be a channel of his love? I just want to illustrate this. I'm not asking, will you be a container for his love? No. I mean, that's good. That's where it starts, being a container. But God's asking you today, not will you just be a container for his love, but will you be a channel? Will you be, if you like, a funnel for his love? And I want to challenge you this year. Will you move beyond being just a container? Many believers, they're just containers. They receive and they receive, and that's good. That's the start. But I want to ask you, would you become a funnel? Would you become a channel for God's love to situations and to a crisis you might face this year, or a crisis you might have to walk into this year? Of course, here's the challenge. Many people just remain a container because, here's why. It goes on, verse 18, 1 John 4. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. Again, underline that. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. Perfect love drives out fear. What's the opposite of love? What's the opposite of love? Have you thought about that? Most people will quickly say hate or envy. That's what I first thought, but the Bible teaches the opposite of love is fear. You see, the more fear, the less love. Fear and love cannot be in the same space. They cannot coexist in the same space. And here's the challenge for us. A crisis often exposes what is in your heart, either love or fear. It doesn't create it, but it does expose it. And that's exactly what's happened in the last year all around the world. That's why in the last year we've seen acts of sacrificial love, I believe like never before, like I've not seen in my lifetime. We've seen the care and love of the NHS staff going the extra mile to help sick people. We've seen charities feeding and caring for people who are in need. We've seen neighbours who've never even connected with each other before, helping each other out in the lockdowns and in the pandemic. We've seen churches, I specifically have seen churches scrambling to serve congregations that are now online and asking questions of how do we do that well in this space. I've seen love like I've not seen it really expressed in my lifetime in the last year. But on the other hand, and you know what I'm talking about, I've seen social media be worse than ever in this last year with judgmentalism and mistrust. Anyone with a differing opinion is scorned or ridiculed or joked about. Or from Brexit to the US elections, I think we're more divided than ever in this world. We've seen people, even when it comes to the vaccines, there's a new phrase taking prominence in our world, anti-vaxxers. It's a new phrase. It's always been there, but it's come to the forefront in the last year. Everyone seems to have opinion. And of course, everyone is right and everyone can prove it. And at the root of all of that division and judgmentalism, all of that fear of the government and fear of the disease and fear of dying, of the vaccine, of anyone in power. It's fear. And fear when it goes deep, fear when it takes hold, doesn't just stay as fear. It's like fear mutates. Fear mutates like the virus that we're facing at the moment. It mutates into anger and hatred and all sorts of self-righteousness and dysfunction. Now you've seen it on your television sets. You might even witness it when you go out for a walk today and go shopping. Even on our streets and in the shops, I walked around the park this week and most people smiled and said hello. And hopefully I'm leaning into that and I'm the first one to say, how you doing? Good morning, hello. But a few people, and they're becoming more and more, looked angry that I was even outside and tried hard to not keep 2 meters, but 4 meters away from me, cowering on the side of the grass or shading their faces, determined not to even look my way with a kind of suspicion or disdain. And, what is that? It's when fear that started maybe logically, has kind of evolved and mutated into a distrust and a judgmentalism. No. The Bible says perfect love, when it comes into us, perfect love, it pushes out fear. It forces, it casts out, another translation says, it casts out fear. Love in a crisis. Love in a crisis. So back to my story. So I'm stood in a murder scene that I wasn't expecting. It's a full-on crisis moment. The gunman is still not caught, so I'm kind of feeling a certain amount of fear. But the fear is being pushed out because I love this family more than I fear the situation. I care for this family. They didn't deserve this, and you need to know right now, I'm not a Mother Teresa or a St. Paul, but perfect love comes from God. And when perfect love, and you allow it to not just be a container, but you allow it to be a vessel, a channel, you allow it to flood through you, you find that perfect love casts out fear. And that love was able to push the natural fear that I was feeling away. But here's the question, but what is love at that moment? What is love at that moment? At that moment, I was asking the question, how do I become a channel or a funnel in that situation for the love of God? And it's very simple. The answer is very simple. It's a bit like what we're doing as a church at the moment. We're using just that word BLESS, bless. the blessed principles we're following at the moment as a church. And so I hadn't heard of these all those years ago, but under my breath, I'm beginning with prayer. I'm asking God, what do I do? What do I bring to this situation? How do I just become a conduit, a channel, a funnel for your love right now? And then, this is sometimes difficult for me as a speaker and a person who talks a lot. Then I was listening for what is their need right now. Often we can assume what people's needs are and we can get it just totally wrong. And then moving on, I was thinking, okay, I want to listen to these people, know what their needs are now, and then find a way to serve them. So the starting point was, okay, that's really obvious. The starting point was clean up all the blood, get rid of the mattresses, the blankets and everything. So you wouldn't do this probably outside of South Africa, but the crime scene investigation was over. So we dug a big hole in the garden and we buried everything, clothing, mattresses, blankets, all soaked. We put them all in a big hole and covered it up in the garden. But surprisingly, the number one concern, and I got this by listening to the kids were more upset because they couldn't now go to school the next day because all of their uniforms were ruined, covered in blood. So after cleaning the house, getting rid of all of that, getting it back to normal, the following morning I picked up the kids, they all jumped in the car and we went shopping around town for new uniforms and shoes and socks and bags and everything that had been ruined. We just simply replaced. Why? Because that was what they needed at that moment. That was being a channel of God's love for them at that moment. And first, I want to reiterate, it wasn't my love. I am not Mother Teresa. I don't have the capability for that. But it was me just saying, God, use me at this moment. Let God just use me as a channel for your love to come through me. And that love overcame my fear, my apprehension about the situation. It literally cast out the fear that I had. So I was able to be a channel of love. And lastly, here's the key verse. Verse 19, still in 1 John 4. Verse 19 says these words. Let's read it together if you've got your Bible. We love because he first loved us. Again, I love that. Why do we even love? How can we love at that level? Why? Because he first loved us. And I love that. There's another example in Scripture. Romans 5 verse 8 says this: while we were God haters, one translation says, while we were hating God, while we had our backs turned on him in our sin, he died for us. He showed us the ultimate love. And so the question is, when we consider how much we're loved by God, how can we not share that love with other people? Whether they're in a crisis or not in a crisis. This year, we are going to have hundreds of possibilities in times of crisis to be the love of God for people. So I'll leave you with 2 suggestions this morning. First suggestion is this: ask how you can receive more of God's love today. Yeah, okay, get your vessel ready. Get your container ready. How can you practically do that? Well, I don't know. However you think you can do that today. He loved you as a sinner. How much more, my friend, does he love you today if you're a believer today? And you might want to, you might want to do something practical right now. You might want to replay this live stream. Take 5 minutes to listen to the track again, The Reckless Love of God, that we played just a few moments ago, and just soak in his love. Close your eyes and let God's love just envelope you. Let him just put his arms around you. Just have that sense that God is pouring his love into you. So that's the first thing I want to suggest. The second thing I'd suggest is, after that, find ways to share his love today. As you step out and find new ways to share his love, that will break any fear you have in your heart. The fear of talking to somebody about God's love, or the fear of even approaching somebody. Let that fear be replaced with God's love. Go to somebody. If you can't shake their hands, social distance, I get it. You can't hug them yet. Maybe you can just smile. Maybe something practical. Maybe cleaning up after a flood or something that they've experienced in their lives. We can all do something today. We can all bless somebody today with God's love. Don't let this crisis this year produce fear. That I promise you, if you let it produce fear, it will mutate and not mutate to anything good, but let it be an excuse. Let's have that as an excuse this year, the COVID and the lockdown and other things we're going to face. Let them be an excuse to love like never before. God is love. Let's not forget that today. Let's receive it. Let's let it fill us. But then let's be this week. Let's be one of these. Let's be a way that let's be a channel. Let's be a conduit. Let's be a funnel to people around us in our world. Thanks for listening today. God bless you and have a great weekend.